Space, the final frontier. Except for all of the other frontiers. Yes. Today, we're talking about the ill-fated mission to the moon, Apollo 13. It's an intense story of overcoming hardship, solving problems in front of you, and the human spirit in the face of adversity. Have either of you heard of the story of Apollo 13?
Yes, but my knowledge of the details is extremely vague.
Yeah, I think I've seen this Tom Hanks movie, but I don't remember it very well.
What's the movie with Liv Tyler in it? That's not this one.
That's
another space
Armageddon?
one.
Is that Armageddon?
I get it mixed up with that one.
Different movie, yeah.
I know,
Not based on real events.
No, I know.
That's the movie where they needed to blow up an asteroid. So instead of training some astronauts to operate machinery, they trained some miners to become astronauts.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly how NASA would do it. Anyway, let's begin. In 1969, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were the first people on the moon in the mission Apollo 11. This was the goal that was set by President Kennedy as part of the Cold War, and it was initially budgeted to have 15 rockets for the attempt at the moon. And despite Apollo being number 11, it was actually the fifth mission to try and hit the moon, which meant they had 9 more rockets to send to space. The primary purpose of the Apollo's 11 and 12 missions were to prove that humans could accurately hit the moon by firing a metal canister filled with human beings and a buttload of fuel and hit it accurately. And so Apollo 13 was decided to have a more sciencey approach. The aim was to go into space, collect a load of rocks, and then come back down with lots of samples that then smarter people down on the planet could do sciencey stuff on. Being the third time that humans were going to the moon, the general public were getting a little bit bored, because that's what the general public are like.
By the way, the implication...
Like, okay, we've done this
the implication that just getting there in the first place wasn't sciencey will probably upset some, old NASA employees.
At least I'm not saying they didn't go up there, eh?
Could be worse.
No one really cared about this third attempt to go to the moon, and so there was a real risk that the budget for NASA, which they had for the future launches, could be cut.
Right.
So it was really, really important that the Apollo 13 mission went well, and they had lots of stuff to prove from it.
Not just well, but it had to be exciting. Needs a story.
It didn't have to be exciting. It didn't need a story. It just needed to be doing valuable stuff.
Functional.
For PR purposes.
Yeah. The crew of Apollo 13 were distinguished. The commander was Jim Lovell Jr., who had done 3 previous space flights. In his previous flight, Apollo 8, he had orbited the moon, and then coming within touching distance of the surface of the moon. It was his dream to actually land on the moon and feel the dust and grab some rocks. That was his dream.
He looks like Saul
Alongside...
Goodman from Better Call Saul.
He does, doesn't he? He's a cheeky little happy smiley chappy, isn't he? Alongside him were first-timers Ken Mattingly and Fred Hayes. It was Mattingly's job to pilot the spaceship that flew to the moon, which was the command module. And then it was Hayes' job to pilot the lunar module, which would then take Lovell and Hayes down to the surface, whilst Mattingly would would go round the moon a couple of times.
Oh, cool.
So if you imagine this as like the Apollo 11 missions, Jim Lovell is the equivalent of Neil Armstrong. Mm-hmm. Fred Hayes is Buzz Aldrin, and Ken Mattingly is the other one.
Did you say the other one?
That's so mean, isn't it? That's such a naughty joke. I can't even remember who he is. A week before the launch of Apollo 13, the lunar module pilot of the backup crew, a guy called Charles Duke, contracted rubella from a friend of his son at like a birthday party, accidentally infecting all other members of both the primary and the backup crews of the mission.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Surely you got to keep the primary crew and, the understudies separate for exactly that reason. What's the point in having understudies if they all just get sick because of one person?
Well, this wasn't necessarily the end of the world, as everybody had previously contracted rubella and was immune.
Okay.
This was, however, except for Ken Mattingly. Mattingly potentially could have started showing symptoms at any time over the next 2 weeks, and they were unable to tell whether he actually had it. It wasn't like COVID, he couldn't have stuck a swab up his nose and figured out whether he had it on an LFT. This was a problem, right? Ordinarily, if one member of the team was taken out by an illness, the entire primary team would get taken out and put onto a new mission later, and the secondary team would then back up and replace them. However, Charles Duke was unwell from rubella, and so that entire secondary team couldn't be placed on.
Which is why they're supposed to be kept separate, surely.
Yeah. So NASA would not risk Mattingly suddenly getting ill, as they couldn't also risk shutting down the mission as well, because the PR disaster of that, because they had no public sort of interest at the moment, and if they just cancelled it because someone got rubella, that's just going to be a massive PR disaster.
Right.
So what they did was they split the teams, turning the close-knit trio of Lovell, Mattingly and Hayes into the slightly less tight-knit team of Lovell, Swigert and Hayes, with Jack Swigert replacing Mattingly only 2 days before the launch.
Scary.
It's really scary. So they trained together. They both the backup and the primary trained together, but they trained in their sort of close-knit groups of 3. So you'd have imagined Lovell, Hayes and Mattingly training for like 18 months together, and they were the backup crew for the Apollo 11 mission as well. So if something happened to Neil Armstrong, we'd have all known who Jim Lovell Jr. was. So they were an incredibly close-knit team, and one of them had to sort of sit it out, and had to bring on someone who they just didn't know very well.
I mean, even if you've worked in a restaurant, you know the like advantages of working with people who you've worked with a lot in the past,
especially in such a tight circumstances like that. You have to be able to, like, it's like choreography. You have to be able to dance around people, like
exactly
in kitchens and things. Yeah.
So Liftoff. The mission launched exactly on schedule at 2:13 on April the 11th, 1970, on a beautiful sunny day. The Saturn V rocket shot the astronauts into space. There was a minor hiccup as the second stage rockets shut off about 2 minutes early due to what's called a pogo oscillation, which is where the rocket vibrates due to the pressure in the fuel tanks. Fortunately, the third stage rockets started automatically afterwards, and it enabled them to just fly straight up, and it didn't matter. They didn't come hurtling down. They reached pretty much exactly where they were aiming for, which says to me that it wasn't that precise if you could shut off a rocket for 2 minutes early and still arrive exactly where you went to. They had too much fuel in that rocket. The astronauts breathed a sigh of relief and settled in for the 3-day journey from the Earth to the Moon. Oh, it's really tense now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking, something's going to go wrong, but you don't know what it is.
I remember from the existence of the Apollo 13 Tom Hanks movie that something goes wrong, but I don't remember what. And yeah.
So throughout the 3-day flight from the Earth to the Moon, astronauts did various sciencey things, and that included TV broadcasts back to Earth. 55 hours into the flight, they began one of those broadcasts that they did. Unfortunately, due to the blasé attitude of the public, this broadcast was not shown on any television channels and was only seen by a private audience back in Houston.
That's so funny to imagine, like, these guys are going to the moon. Okay, so they've done it before.
And no one cared.
They're still going to the moon. Like, nobody cares anymore. That's not still cool.
Yeah.
It's not cool to go to the moon anymore. It used to be cool to go to the moon. What happened?
Back in my day.
Well, yeah, back in my day, think I was with it and now I'm not with it, or whatever that quote is. Shortly after the broadcast, 56 hours into the flight, on April the 13th...
Unlucky for some.
I know, right? Mission Control asked the astronauts to do a routine task involving the liquid oxygen tanks, which were used by both the fuel to combust and also the people to breathe. Liquid oxygen had a tendency to settle at the bottom of the tanks, and this made measuring the content of the tanks a little bit difficult. So because it would just sort of settle and sort of compress, you couldn't actually tell how much oxygen you had in those tanks.
Right, so you'd need to be able to measure not just the volume, but the density, and you can't really weigh things in space normally.
Yeah. So in order to combat this, the astronauts had to regularly turn on a fan and heater, which was at the bottom of the tanks, which would then swish the oxygen around and make the measurements accurate again. Jack Swigert flipped the switch that turned on the fans, and a few seconds later uttered the immortal words, "Houston, we have a problem."
That's the line I know. Yeah, something happened. What?
The astronauts heard a loud bang, and the ship had contorted, crinkling the metal tube that connected the main command module and the lunar landing module. So you can see the lunar landing module on the left-hand side here, where that connected to the little pyramid-y triangle thing, that sort of crinkled.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Yeah. Down in Mission Control, there was panic. Almost every single console in Houston was showing an error. As the errors were so widespread, it was assumed that there was an issue with the electronics and that the spaceship was fine. But up in space, 200,000 miles from home, the astronauts had a different understanding. Initially, they thought it might have been a strike from an asteroid. Staring at his control panels, Jim Lovell could see that one of the oxygen tanks was reading as empty, and after 5 minutes, the other was slowly starting to reduce. He looked out the window and saw gas escaping from the back of the aircraft. The spacecraft, not aircraft.
Shit.
It was... Yeah. It's so bad. It was clear to Mission Control and the crew that the first tank was empty and the second one was slowly leaking. This was a problem. This is a problem for a number of reasons. Number one, they needed the oxygen to breathe. Number two, they needed the oxygen for the fuel to get home. And number three, they needed the oxygen to power the fuel to power all of the electronics.
Oxygen, important.
Really important. They instantly knew that the mission to the moon was dead. And now all hands were on deck to get them back home. It was decided, in order to get home, they would need to use the lunar landing module as a lifeboat to hold the astronauts for the entire journey. The lunar module was designed to take 2 astronauts down to the moon. It had its own supply of air, water and batteries for that exact purpose. It was intended to be used for 45 hours and then be left on the moon when the astronauts went back home. There was also a little bit of oxygen and battery power left in the command module that was used for the final part of the mission, when they've sort of got rid of the back of it and they're just flying back into the Earth. They needed that oxygen and power to do that re-entry, as the command module was the only part of the ship with a heat shield that would stop them from burning up when they re-entered the atmosphere. So Swigert turned off the command module to save as much power and as much oxygen as they could, whilst Lovell and Hayes powered up the lunar module so that they could get home. They were safe for now, but there was still a question of how exactly would they get home. There were 2 choices. Do you use the main engines to turn the ship around and get home in 36 hours? Or do you swing around the moon and get home in 4 days? What would you do?
Oh, that's terrifying. So obviously, the first option, you're expending your fuel and your oxygen, so you're burning through everything much faster to get home faster, versus using the moon, hoping that you can wait out without expending all your fuel and oxygen in that process. Oh, well, I don't know how those things balance, but I'm going to assume, since the much wackier and more terrifying sounding option is to just use the moon to, like, swing you back round, I'm going to guess that they did that one.
Well, the risk with using the main engine was that they had no idea what the damage was.
Right.
If the engine exploded, they were dead. If it didn't have enough power to change trajectory, you could hit the moon, or even worse, you could fly out into space and never be able to get back. Going around the moon was safer,
Right.
as they could use a smaller engine to do small changes to enable that. However, there was a big problem. The lunar module was designed for 2 people for 45 hours. We're talking 3 people now for 4 days. How are you both feeling at this current situation?
Nervous.
That's completely terrifying. Like,
It's
in
so
space,
scary.
and you're basically having to like hijack the functions of this rocket to use it for a completely different, not completely different, obviously, but like fairly radically different purpose, because it's been designed to do this one very specific job. Like, ugh. Whilst in space, you're having to like hijack your machine and re-engineer it to serve completely different functions. And you've only been in space
200,000
like
miles away
3
from
times
home.
total. Like,
This has the
as
real
a
feeling.
culture.
This is reminding me of my hot air balloon episode, and them being, you know, way too many 1,000 feet of like above Earth, trying to, hands too cold to do anything, trying to fix the wiring with their teeth.
In the end, they didn't want to risk the main engine, and so they fired up the rocket at the bottom of the lunar module and set a course for around the moon. As they circled the moon, work began to increase the time that they could live on the lunar module lifeboat. They shut everything down, all the electrical systems, including the heating.
Oof.
It got cold,
Oof.
really cold, enough to freeze their water supplies and their food.
Oh.
They were freezing, thirsty, hungry, and unable to sleep. About 30 hours into the emergency, they realised that something else could have killed them. And something that you only get from breathing: carbon dioxide. As the astronauts breathed out, the carbon dioxide started to accumulate. The lunar modules had filters on them that would stop that from being a problem. However, they were designed for 2 people for 45 hours. And they'd been filled with 3 people within 24 hours, basically. The command module also had filters, so the plan was to use those filters to fix the problem. Unfortunately, there was a small hiccup. The filters on the lunar module were circular, and the filter on the command module was square, so they couldn't be installed. They had to make a square peg fit a round hole, and they had just what was on board in order to do it. Mission Control managed to figure out how to do it and explain the procedure entirely over voice, and it worked. The filters managed to start reducing the carbon dioxide, stopping them from dying, not breathing.
So they had to have had like engineers working with like duplicate parts on the ground, trying to mash stuff together and thinking at the same time, like, what tools do the astronauts have? Like, they don't have all the tools that we have.
So, in the film, there's a really famous scene where you've got these guys in like ties and shirts, around like a conference table, and someone brings in a box and goes like pours it all over the table. This is what they've got up there. We need to make a round peg hit a square pole or whatever. This is what you've got to do it. You can't add anything else. You can't do anything else. Like, they have some duct tape. They have some manuals. They have some, bags. They have like pee bags and stuff like that. Tubes, things like that. And you see in these photos, that's how they managed to do it. They literally like duct taped this square filter with some like plastic wrap to make it fit. And it's really, really fortunate that it works. Okay, so they'd managed to get through every ordeal and they were almost at Earth. However, there were 2 things that were stopping them. One was that they needed to turn the command module back on. And 2, they needed to adjust their trajectory or they would bounce off the atmosphere and hurtle into space. Turning it back on was tricky. Normally, the module would be turned on back on Earth when they had essentially unlimited power supply. It had never been turned on with the battery power of the module. Engineers had been working on this problem for the entire journey back. If they turned on everything, it may not have worked. It might not have been able to stay on. It might have short-circuited. It might have had all sorts of problems. However, if they didn't turn some things on, it might not turn on at all. So they needed to find the correct order to turn specific things on in such a way as to ensure that they could get home. It was an 800-step procedure, and they had to be guided by ground control. They were cold, They were hungry and thirsty, they'd had no sleep, and one mistake would result in their death. There was no do-over. But they managed it. The module was back online and they were ready to make it home. You can see steps 35, 36 and 37 on the left here.
Oh, Christ.
That's... imagine 800 of those steps.
Oh no.
If cis 5C D6 all read or more omit preheat. Oh my god. I suppose they had some training to understand what on earth this means.
Yes. Yeah.
But I...
Looks scary to me.
Imagine 800 of those steps.
I'd rather not. Our checklist for recording is plenty complicated enough for me.
It's like 7 steps.
And I still get it wrong like half the time.
No, the thing that I was worst at school in maths was just keeping tallies of things. Just the ability
Counting
to
is hard.
just do one thing, then another thing. Like,
Yes.
Don't tell anybody who wants to hire me, but attention to detail is not my forte.
Yeah, I'd always write it down on my CV, but it was objectively a lie.
Yeah.
There was one final problem. They needed to readjust their trajectory. They were currently aiming a little bit too shallow at the Earth, and much like a stone on water,
Right.
they would just bounce off the atmosphere, a bit like when you skim stones. If that happened, they would never be seen again. So they'd have made that entire journey and then just been lost to space.
Gosh.
The guidance system was off, and it was unable to be turned on as part of the power on procedure. So they literally had to eyeball it. They had to look out the window, and using the line between day and night on Earth as their guide, they had to burn the side rockets from the lunar module for exactly 14 seconds.
Ah!
Any less, and they would have bounced off. But any more, and they would have come in too flat and burned up. But once again, these amazing astronauts managed to do it.
Absolutely terrifying.
They detached the lunar module and approached the atmosphere. When a spaceship enters the atmosphere, the friction from the air resistance heats up the ship to 1,650 degrees Celsius. This heat causes interference, which means no communications between the ship and ground control can be heard for at least 4 minutes, sometimes a bit longer. This is the most nerve-wracking part of returning from Earth, basically.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm.
It got to 4 minutes, and they weren't heard from. Another 30 seconds passed after that 4 minutes, and they still weren't heard from. Another minute after that, and they still weren't heard from. And then suddenly, a communication from the ship. They'd landed safely in the Pacific Ocean on April the 17th, 1970, a whole 4 days after their near-fatal accident.
That's terrifying. That's, yeah. Mm-hmm. Incredible. I see why they made a movie of that.
Yeah. You hear that and you think, wow, somebody should make a movie.
Yeah. I'm like, oh, damn, that would make a good movie.
Maybe with Tom Hanks in it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Kevin Spacey.
Is it Kevin Spacey?
Kevin Spacey?
No,
Is
it's
it?
the
No,
guy.
Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, okay, yeah. They're not Kevin Spacey. Let's not put him in any more movies. He's had enough.
So what happened? This is a photo from when they jettisoned this is like the service module. It's what has all like the oxygen and fuel and stuff. When they got rid of that just before they were leaving, they took a photo of the side of it as it was floating past. And this is that photo. When turning on the fan that spun the liquid oxygen around, there was some Teflon coating on the wires that were inside the fan. That was damaged, and it enabled a short circuit of the wire, making a spark. And as we all know from the fire triangle, ignition plus oxygen equals fire.
Don't want sparks in the oxygen tank.
This expanded the pressure inside of the tank, leading to an explosion in one of the oxygen tanks. This then forced a connection between the fuel tank and the oxygen tanks to close, and be unable to reopen. It also caused a leak in the second oxygen tank, which then slowly leaked oxygen until it was empty. The team were incredibly lucky that it didn't break the integrity of the inside of the spaceship.
Yeah, that's...
as that would have caused instant death.
That's just an exploding tank right there, like... yeah.
None of the crew of Apollo 13 ever flew to space again.
Yeah.
Jack Swigert was scheduled to go into space again in the future, but was caught in a scandal involving astronauts taking envelopes into space.
Oh, wow.
Envelopes into space?
Yeah. There were 4 more Apollo missions, the last one being December 1972, which is the last time humans ever set foot on the moon. What a story, eh?
Yeah, incredible. It is so interesting that they just stopped going to the moon. I mean, I guess it's like, yeah, we've been now. We like
very expensive.
It's well studied for what it's got on it, I guess, and they're just like, don't need to stand on it to kind of know stuff about it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what sort of made the moon landings happen was the Cold War.
Yes, yeah.
And we're not in the Cold War
right,
anymore, and so it's hard to justify those expenses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.